Good morning. I'm Nairi Woods, Dean of the Blavatnik School of Government, and let me welcome you to this online discussion here at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. Today's discussion marks the launching of an important report on COVID-19 and crisis preparation in an era of long emergencies. And COVID-19 was, of course, for every government in the world, a crisis unprecedented in our lifetimes. You could go back to the 1918 influenza pandemic, but few people from that era survive today. And in early conversations with the Wellcome Trust and its then head, we decided to launch a process to actually look at what are the lessons for governments about crisis management when we look at the early part of COVID. And I was delighted when Professor Ciaran, Professor of Practice here at the Blavatnik School, stepped in to lead this. Ciaran worked at the highest level of government in the Cabinet Office, taking various senior roles, but then very importantly was the founding chief executive of Britain's National Cyber Security Centre. And in that role, he successfully took Britain from a rather ad hoc crisis management approach to cyber to a proactive, interventionist, strategic approach to cybersecurity. And that perhaps makes it unsurprising that one of the first things that Ciaran did when taking on this task was to define its remit not as a kind of shadow government inquiry of who did what and when, not as another commission on pandemic preparedness, but rather as a really hard look at how it is that governments need to prepare for long-term crises. Most governments, most companies around the world are all set up to deal with the short-term crisis, the terrorist attack, the flood, the accident, and they have a crisis response mechanism tailored for that. But as Ciaran pointed out right from the beginning, the kinds of crises that governments are now being asked to manage are much longer term. We've seen even since the end of the COVID-19 pandemic crisis response, the crisis brought about from the invasion into Ukraine of floods of refugees, which has turned into a much longer term challenge for governments. We've seen the energy crisis sustain and be a much more long-term crisis. And of course, every indication is that environmental change, climate change, is going to give governments a very significant long-term set of crises to manage. And it's for that reason that I am so pleased that Ciaran has led a process to be right at the forefront of thinking about how we enable and what governments need to do to prepare to manage these long-term crises. And one of the first things Ciaran did was bring in two very brilliant researchers who are sitting here with us today, Dr. Hester Khan and Maximilian Fink, who have done an extraordinary job, and Ciaran will say more about their contributions to this terrific report. I'm going to let Ciaran outline what the report actually does in our discussion. The focus is very much around the central crisis management function of government, the ability of governments around the world to scale up at speed and to sustain that capability through a long crisis, and the coordination between the center of government and local governments in Britain, the devolved parts of Britain in delivering that crisis. And of course, every country had to deal with these three issues. And the report makes some wonderful observations and lessons learned from Singapore, from Australia, from Germany, and from Italy. And that makes this a really rich, wonderful report to read. Now, today, to start the discussion, we're particularly honored to have Professor Sir David Omand, uniquely qualified to open up this discussion as both a practitioner and a scholar. Sir David is the former director of GCHQ and former permanent secretary of the Home Office and formerly the Homeland Security Advisor to Prime Minister Tony Blair from 2001 to 2006. So he's been right in the cockpit of crisis management in government, but subsequently, very much as a scholar and researcher, has published several very well-received books, but particularly for today's discussion, it's his forthcoming book that we're all waiting for with bated breath. It's going to be published on the 1st of June by Penguin, and it's called Surviving a Crisis, Lessons in Resilience and Avoiding Disaster. So David, thank you for joining us this morning, and we really look forward to your reflections on what others might take away from this new report at the Blavatnik School, Crisis Preparation in the Age of Long Emergencies. So David, if I can ask you to open the discussion today.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to contribute this morning. I welcome this report from the Blavatnik School, both in its own right, because it's a big contribution to thinking about preparations for future long crises, but it's also going to be a valuable input to Baroness Hallett's independent public inquiry into the COVID-19 experience in the UK. The Blavatnik report really gives us something now to bite on. The literature looking back on crisis management is extensive, but my experience as the UK government's chief crisis manager after 9/11 is that, frankly, too often you don't manage a crisis, it ends up managing you. And you know you're in crisis by what I call the rubber levers test. So the metaphorical control may have many warning lights flashing, alarms sounding, but the levers, the switches, nothing seems to have the effect that those in charge were led to expect, or even to be sometimes connected to the outside world. So you pull the lever, but you seem to be disconnected from the reality on the ground. And then you discover new problems arising, as the Blavatnik report illustrates, because you're taking measures to try and control the situation, such as closing schools in a pandemic, and that then creates further issues. And that's really because of the nature of crisis itself. There can be nobody watching who has not experienced a crisis of some sort. It may have been at work following some hostile takeover, market disruption, or, tragically, some external catastrophe that for a while turns our world upside down. And the key characteristic is that events just keep hitting us with a speed and intensity that normal responses can't hope to placate. It's kind of like being in a car out of control in bad weather, not responding to the brakes. Now, what makes a crisis more than just a big emergency is the realization that, at least for a short time, that pace and scale of events is overwhelming even planned responses. And for many of those affected, life will never be the same again. And in today's complex society, the responses we adopt can themselves have unwelcome consequences and then generate concurrent crises. And you just need to look at what's been happening to global supply chains, for example, and their fragility when exposed to a crisis. Now, you can think of a typical arc of crisis. You detect the first signs of trouble. There's an initial stage of confusion, a frantic search for evidence of what is actually going wrong and why. And then, with luck, you get clarification, commitment to action, particularly to protect lives and property. And then, we hope, consolidation, clearing up. The final stages usually drag on because you have inquests, you have independent investigations, you may have civil court cases brought by families of victims, and the need to complete the cleanup and the repair of all the damage, including economic damage, and that can take years. What then results is a new normal. I think of experiencing a crisis as being in an unstable situation. The situation can flip either way. If there's been good preparation, then support can be quickly available, so the developing crisis quickly reverts back to being a manageable emergency, or if you're lucky, even be avoided altogether. but a crisis for which we have not properly prepared can flip the other way, sliding into disaster with significant loss of life and financial and environmental damage. And some situations can't be pulled back, and all you can attempt to do is reduce the harm being done. I very much endorse the appeal that's in this Blavatnik report that we need to invest in coordination, capacity, capability to create the resilience that can make all the difference in managing the crisis down into manageable emergencies and preventing that slide into disaster. The Blavatnik report predicts an era of long emergencies that we're in for. Well, there's no shortage, as I found writing the book, of raw material for writing about modern crisis, a war in Europe, energy crisis, continuing pandemic, now bird flu, catastrophic earthquake in Turkey, floods, drought, famine, other environmental disasters caused by climate change, or possibly terrorist atrocities, some massive cyber attacks, and all the international disputes and conflict that go on. And it's important, I think, to recognize that all of these have consequences closer to home. And for many families, sadly, the impact of a global crisis turns out to be profoundly personal. And as the Blavatnik report reminds us, in the end, all crises end up local somewhere in their effects. Most writers on crisis feel there's a useful distinction to be drawn between the crises caused by sudden major shocks, they just arrive with little or no warning, and what I describe as the slow burn problems. Could be in the family, could be in business, could be in government. And they can fester for years before they suddenly burst upon us as full-blown crises. And some of these crises in waiting are already in plain view. These are the elephants in the room. These are the issues that governments and executives in C-suites too often choose to ignore. They're kind of listening, but they're not really hearing. Of course, to admit early to the existence of some slow burn crisis is to admit that the present policies and strategy for which the leaders are themselves responsible is actually failing to deliver the desired results. Deep down, it's too often easier for leaders to find reasons to justify delay. I mean, they know that should the crisis actually break, at least the case for change can be more easily made. But it's these slow burn crises that I think will pose us the greatest problem, precisely because they've been overlooked or ignored, or simply not been properly understood, that they pose a major threat. It gives time for the situation to progressively worsen. And by the time some unexpected stroke of bad luck causes the crisis eventually to break, the problems may be so deep-rooted as to be near insoluble. In those circumstances, frankly, those in charge should expect some significant reputational damage for allowing the situation to get to that point. So, in conclusion, let's be optimistic. Not every unexpected disruption in our lives need become a crisis, provided we've prepared ourselves for the possibility. And not every crisis need tip into failure and disaster, provided, of course, that we have previously invested sufficiently in personal, corporate, and national resilience, one of the themes of the Blavatnik report. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Sir David, for such an eloquent plea to governments to notice that they're ignoring the elephant in the room, the slow-burning crises, to pay more heed to it. And, you know, you've given us a lovely close-up picture of what governments can aim to do in managing that disequilibrium, as you describe it, and turning the crisis into a manageable crisis. Ciaran, you've led this report. You can tell us about what it is that governments can do to address this. So let me turn to Ciaran Martin, as I said, Professor of Practice here in the Blavatnik School of Government and lead author of the report.
Thank you, Nairi. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining. I will start with some thanks, firstly, to Sir David for that excellent contribution and for many years of mentorship in this and other fields of national security, to you, Nairi, for sponsoring the project, to the Wellcome Trust, to the brilliant team, Dr. Hester Khan, who led a lot of the work on analysis of the central crisis management system, and Maximilian Fink, who led our international comparative analysis, and to everyone joining, including those who posted the proof of audio life during the technical disruptions when Sir David was speaking. It's an honour to launch this report. I want to be clear on the question we were trying to ask. As Nairi said, it is not an attempt to second-guess proper inquiries. It is not an attempt to pick over individual decisions. It's trying to answer a question that if, or as we've heard, probably when, there's another emergency that affects all of us, or at least most of us, directly for a long time, what do we want the state here in the UK that deals with this crisis to look like, particularly at the start? Now, why did we ask that question? I think there are really two reasons for that. The first, we've heard from both Nairi and Sir David about the likelihood that we're entering an era of long emergencies. We might not be, and we can hope that we're not, and I won't regurgitate and repeat some of the things that have been written elsewhere and have been said this morning about the trends that point in that direction. But again, as Sir David has said, we can look back at an article in the Times last August by Lord Hague, William Hague, the former Foreign Secretary, where he also described once-in-a-lifetime events as the new normal, looking at all the things that have happened this century, whether it was a pandemic, a financial crisis, a land war in Europe, where, to use another of the cliches being invoked at the moment, the unthinkable becomes not just thinkable, but a reality. So it is a prudent assumption that crises of this nature, not just public health, may hit us again in our lifetime, and the report analyses some of the literature around that. The second is that what part of our response to COVID, I think, revealed is that the British state's crisis response system was built and actually quite successful and pretty experienced at dealing with short, perhaps localized emergencies, terrorist attacks and floods being two that sadly occurred all too frequently in the first 2 decades of this century, and the state was well practiced and well versed at that. Now, however awful and tragic those crises were for those involved, the vast majority of the population will have encountered them through televisual and other media, and perhaps very limited disruption to travel to particular areas for a short period of time. And that is what the state was practiced in managing and had a very strong international reputation for, which it deserved. But COVID was a completely different order and duration, and that changes things. So two of the deliberate methodological approaches we took. Firstly, we just looked at the first 6 months of the UK and other countries' management of COVID. Now that was deliberate not just for scope and having a realistic time frame, but also because COVID lasted essentially 2 years. By the end of the pandemic, the UK and most other governments had innovated and put in place new structures, procedures, frameworks and policies that they felt comfortable with. In the UK's case, some of them were globally lauded, some of them were very heavily criticised, but they were deliberate choices made by the government after the crisis had started and the government had some familiarity with what it was. But the next time, the one thing we know is we will not predict the exact contours of what's going to hit us. So what do we want there at the start? The other thing that's important is the need to learn from the experience of others, both good and bad. And again, for manageability reasons, but also for comparability reasons, the various things we were looking at, we focused in depth in 4 countries, Singapore, Germany, Italy, and Australia. I should say that amongst those 4, and indeed worldwide, no single country emerges from the pandemic as the obvious exemplar in all areas. And indeed, you can say that particularly as the pandemic went on, other countries will have plenty to learn from some of the successful aspects of the UK's. But it's very important to have those comparators. And indeed, one of the tragic advantages of pandemic scholarship is the fact that there is a universality around it that allows for comparative approaches. So taking all this together, we looked at three main issues in the UK's experience. And the first is the crisis management system itself, which came under real strain. It's important to remember the historical context. This is a central unit of just shy of 100 people, and for most of 2019, they had been working in the unusual subject of preparing for an emergency that to some extent was planned for, which was a no-deal Brexit, and you had 60% of that workforce working flat out on those preparations for that year. The same machine has to then deal with something completely unexpected and all-consuming. But it's important to remember then that that machine is to some extent set aside by April 2020, replaced by long-forgotten acronyms like MIGs, Ministerial Information Groups, by cabinet committees and so forth. The details don't matter particularly, but insofar as they do, they're in the report. What does matter is that a small, nimble, agile, and subject-led, in this case public health, approach proved insufficient to meet the challenge of something so overwhelming as COVID. So the new structures brought in much more economic and social policy planning. It had to cope with a far more dynamic situation than was planned for. So, for example, pandemic preparedness, and yes, as is well known, it was based on a flu pandemic rather than the sort of pandemic that occurred, but had well-versed and well-rehearsed and effective plans for, sadly, the disposal of large amounts of deceased, but didn't really predict and therefore model and therefore plan for, in effect, the voluntary withdrawal of large numbers of people from schools and ultimately the closure of those schools. For all the success of the furlough scheme, parliamentary investigations have shown that indeed there was no real preparation for the economic aspects of an all-consuming catastrophe. So there is a real lesson here about broadening the base of expert advice and the ability to coordinate and the durability of those capabilities. As Lord O'Donnell, the former Cabinet Secretary, put it, the need to follow the sciences, not the science, as per the mantra of the time. So that's the central crisis management capability. The second is about the central government's ability to mobilize capability. And in plainer English, that's kind of about the ability to get lots of stuff that already exists or to invent at huge scale stuff that you need that doesn't exist. And here in the first 6 months, the British state clearly struggled. And whatever, as no doubt the Inquirer will investigate, the controversies over things like PPE procurement and test and trace, and whatever around the success story of the vaccine, what's instructive is that the state made a conscious choice to, in effect, create from thin air entirely new structures rather than be able to mobilize from within. And there's something really worth reflecting on there, as indeed there is something worth reflecting on the views of those who then led those efforts and the sorts of skills gaps, problems in the procurement framework, problems in building networks with the private sector that they encountered. In the end, the UK ended up not just with one of the fastest vaccine rollouts, but actually in terms of testing, by the end of the pandemic, one of the places in the world where it was cheapest and easiest to get a COVID test. So there are some useful things to look at, but all of those structures, whether successful or less successful, were set up in a very ad hoc way because nothing was seen to be there in the first place. And then finally, there is the coordination between the centre and elsewhere in the country, and how that works in something where, as Sir David brought out very, very powerfully, every family in the country is affected. And we looked at two very different dynamics. One is the relationship with local government and other local bodies within England, which is, of course, 84-85% of the UK population. And then the relationship between the UK government in Westminster and Whitehall and the devolved administrations, this being the first long-endurance population-level national emergency in the post-devolution age. There are some really important lessons here. In terms of local government in England, it is, in theory and in law, central to the response mechanism. But it's well known that it's been under acute financial pressure for more than a decade, that during the pandemic, a lot of funding uncertainty beset the sector. There were things that couldn't work even though they were in the plan, such as mutual assistance between local authorities, because that can't work when every local authority is flat out. There were issues around data gathering and data coordination. In one very simple but very powerful example, central government had no idea what local stocks of PPE were at the start. And then there is, I think, quite an important, if sometimes forgotten, part of the pandemic, which is that as you move towards the end of the period we're looking at, towards the early summer of 2020, the government intended to adopt a more localized approach to pandemic management, but essentially found itself unable to do so and reverted later on in 2020 and 2021 into effectively national controls. Why was that? There were issues around data quality, and we look a little bit at, for example, the decision after the easing of restrictions in July to put Leicester into lockdown, with some of the data problems that later emerged, with some of the complaints from local leaders that if they didn't have control over what happened to schools, there was very little they could do, and so on. So in summary, there seems to have been more weight placed on local systems than they could reasonably bear. And that leads to a fundamental choice, which I'll come to when I conclude. But turning quickly to the devolved administrations and the relationship with them, I think, again, there is a lot to learn from this. The four administrations started out with a four nations approach. That was very evident both in letter and in spirit in the Coronavirus Action Plan of the 3rd of March 2020. But by the end of May, that had all but fallen apart. And there are useful lessons here about the model in an emergency. And essentially, there are different ways you can run a devolved constitution in a crisis. Some countries, although very few did it in COVID, will just federalize, if you like, or nationalize the whole thing and temporarily suspend powers. That may or may not work in the UK, but it's certainly a viable model elsewhere. There could be a pretty robust and rigorous system of integrated decision-taking where, in effect, you co-opt and share decision-taking to ensure alignment. Or you can pretty much fully devolve, as one could argue the Australian constitution allows for, and to some extent the German constitution as well, and central government accepts limitations to its role even in an emergency. The challenge in the UK is that those three are all viable options, and the UK didn't really pick any of them, and just took quite a messy settlement that works okay most of the time, but had obvious strains during a crisis. So you had all the little fiddly differences which caused significant practical problems, for example, on the England-Wales border. But you also had potentially quite serious anomalies, which thankfully didn't cause any great difficulty, but might do in another crisis where, and it's set out in the report, the First Minister of Wales finds out to his intense surprise that he is allowed to implement different regulations on international travel from the government as a whole. And this reflects, I think, when the emergency legislation comes in, there is just a lack of understanding of how the system works, so it's just replicated and gives Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland the powers that are being given to the Westminster Parliament in exactly the same areas without thinking through how they might work in this crisis. And one potentially serious aspect of that in a future crisis is the ability of the devolved administration ineffectively to incur costs, in this case through more stringent lockdowns, but without the power to pay for them. You can put that asymmetry one way or the other, but leaving that asymmetry where it is can be quite difficult. So to conclude, I will leave it to Hester to say a little bit more about the coordination. I'll leave it to Max to talk a little bit about the international comparators. But in terms of some of the recommendations and some of the things that would move us forward in terms of this era of long emergencies, I think firstly there are some important points about civil service and state capability. If we are to have longer crises, how many of the 450,000 civil servants in central government and 6.5 million public sector workers can easily be redeployed to various aspects of crisis management? The answer is probably not enough. We should, in my view, look at the crisis capabilities relatively frequently of key response institutions in public health, in energy, in national security, and just test those through audit. We should try to reconfigure the crisis system so that for longer, very serious emergencies, it isn't just subject-led because it's going to be all-consuming. So how do you make sure things like economic, education, and other social policy are very much at the center of that planning and that it's dynamic? We should aim to keep those frameworks that worked in terms of mobilizing rapidly private sector capability in an emergency. And finally, there are questions of the most profound importance about what the British state wants out of local government and what it can reasonably expect in its current posture, the role of local services in an emergency, and there should be an important national conversation on that. And also, difficult politically though it may be, a hard-headed conversation about how those wrinkles, those anomalies in the devolution settlement could be ironed out in a future crisis. So those important issues of coordination, capacity, and capability are at the heart of this report. They're at the heart of our international lessons. And I'll ask Hester briefly to say a little bit more about the coordination and central capabilities.
Thank you, Ciaran. Thank you all for being here this morning with us. It's a pleasure. Yeah, indeed, as Ciaran pointed out, there have been multiple challenges on the UK crisis management system, which had been severely challenged and tested during the COVID-19 crisis. And what the report highlights is that it's really important to have a fundamental look at it to be better prepared for the future, rather than criticizing ad hoc things here and there. So that's what we're aiming in our report, to have a fundamental and constructive discussion on this matter. So here, what I would like to do is just set out the key principles that we think are important in steering this reform. And the first one is that we propose that there should be a clearer link between planning and operational preparation in institutions. So risk planning has always been very important in the UK, and the UK is well advanced on this and internationally highly ranked. But the COVID-19 crisis highlighted a disconnect between this planning and operational governance. So planning in the future needs to be matched with real operational preparation institutions to make sure that institutions have adequate capabilities, capacity, that there's a shared understanding of the crisis management environment they're in and the role divisions. So that's the first point. And the second point we would like to highlight that there should be more inbuilt emphasis on agility and an adaptive mindset of actors working in the system. This concerns all levels, how we deal with planning, how we deal with expertise, and institutional arrangements. So the UK government was initially slow to realise the nature of COVID and in terms of the nature of the virus and the large-scale impact it would bring. And it relied heavily on the established plans that were in place and the science that it had. But this was not enough, and there was not enough agility in the system to respond adequately and promptly to the complexity and changing nature of what was going on. So we propose that to be better prepared for long-term crisis in the future and to deal with the uncertainty and the complexity of crisis like COVID, that the ability of governments needs to be enhanced to be more agile and adaptive. So this could entail a number of things, having a wider range of scenarios to draw from, having a wider range of expertise, as just has been mentioned. Also international data, as Max will expand on. Dynamic assessments in place, but also a change in institutional relations with more flexible response networks in place, like Ciaran just mentioned, to have a larger pool of civil servants trained in crisis management. And the final point, final new key principle we would like to propose, and that concerns more the overall framework and architecture, is that we would like to see more integration and a holistic approach on crisis management, so connecting different institutions and sectors together. So many of the problems in the earlier response towards the COVID-19 pandemic arose from the fact that the crisis was defined and steered as a health crisis rather than a population-wide crisis. And the pandemic highlighted that a health pandemic can have many impacts on other sectors. So we propose that there should be a shared institutional framework between institutions to prepare and steer for future crises. And our research has shown that the early response relies heavily on networks that are in place. So it's very important to foster these relations ahead of a crisis. So in a sense, we propose that the priority and status attached to crisis management should be enhanced in the UK. And this is something we've seen and noticed in our research, that it differs widely across countries. And I will now hand over to my colleague Max, who will say a bit more on our comparative work.
Yes, so thank you so much, Hester, and thank you to everyone for inviting me. I think it's truly an honor to sit here as a student and be invited to such an established and esteemed panel. So yes, speaking about our international comparison, the pandemic, by definition, as an international global occurrence and phenomenon, provided us with the opportunity to put the UK experience into context. And to see how other countries were prepared, how they initially responded, and how they managed this slow-burning aspect characteristic of crisis, and the COVID-19 crisis in particular. We looked, as already mentioned, at Singapore, Germany, Australia, and Italy for that. They're all advanced state systems, have their state systems in place, but vary starkly in various dimensions, such as the mode of governance, geo and demographics, previous experience with nationwide crisis, and fundamentally the overall impact within the first 6 months of the pandemic. So in consideration of the individual circumstances, they still offer very valuable lessons, as Ciaran already mentioned, from their successes, but notably also from their struggles. I will not go into detail in the interest of time, and since we also want to take questions, I believe, and also to incentivize people to actually read our report. But I will make an effort to provide a brief overview to just give a few cornerstones on what we looked at and what should be highlighted about each country. So starting with Singapore, the small city-state, for example, revealed to us how much of a different widespread awareness and expertise in crisis management embedded inherently in the state system can make. And even not just in the state system, but also in the culture of the whole country. However, it cautions us also against how a central and well-aligned government not only can produce very quick actions, but also blind spots, for example, as evidenced through the foreign worker situation in the country. In Germany, in stark contrast, we have a very decentralized system that was based on strong local capabilities and that overall provided a very strong enabling environment. It allowed for productive experimentation and situational responsiveness on the ground, which allowed Germany remarkably to compensate for the lack of preparation for a cutting crisis, like we examine in our report. Also quite remarkable in the German system, as a German myself, I might say, is that the quite rigid system, legalistic system in Germany, showed quite a bit of agility, of flexibility in adjusting purpose-bound structures. Then our other federal state, Australia, tells the story of how our country basically evaded most of the first wave. They established an efficient escalation and escalation mechanisms and procedures, facilitated brave and early decision-making. So by going hard and early, we called it, I believe, it allowed the country to avoid most of the first wave. However, that had also a downside, again, a struggle that we can look at and say, oh, we can draw a lesson out of it. That is, namely, that the emergence of challenges after the first wave showed that Australia didn't take enough time to actually prepare for further developments, again, emphasizing this nature of long-term emergencies. And then finally, Italy, as the first European country hit by COVID-19, exposed dramatically what can happen if a country is actually taken by surprise and has to devise solutions on the go. It still was a champion of reacting, and a lot of countries actually learned a lot of lessons from Italy already during the pandemic. Even though that's just a very few and very broad insights, I hope that gives an idea of how instructive and vital global lesson learning can be before, during, and after a pandemic, and after any other kind of crisis. By conducting this research, we realized also how there is a very strong and pronounced appetite across state systems to learn more from each other, and we hope to nurture this motivation and go further with our report in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. And for those of you interested in comparing different countries' efforts, the other project run out of the Blavatnik School, the Oxford COVID Government Response Tracker, tracked every government in the world's policies on a week-by-week basis across every domain. And it's a wonderful data set if you want to know exactly which country did what and when. But let me encourage you all to download the report. It was wonderfully edited, and I want to acknowledge the role that Ruth Collier here at the Blavatnik School played in editing the report. Right inside the cover, there's 10 lessons. If you're really short of time, download it to read those 10 lessons. If you've got a little more time, there's a wonderful 10-page executive summary. And then there's the report itself, which I do recommend. But let's now move to some questions. So, Ciaran, if I can bring the question to you, and you can bring in Sir David as and when. So a first question is by Rajiv Patni in Delhi. Hello, Rajiv. And he writes, COVID brought forth a major problem in effective communication by governments, leading to an infodemic as an overlay on the pandemic, all the fake information that governments were having to contend with. It complicated the management of the crisis because trust was a victim. How do you suggest we prepare for better and trusted communication in times of crisis?
So, by definition, Sir David and I have not pre-cooked this because it's a question submitted from Delhi. But I might suggest, if I take the sort of government part of this and David takes the information integrity part of this, because they're two quite distinct issues and he's got significant expertise in both, but particularly the second. I think there is something, we haven't brought it out in this discussion, it's brought out to some extent in the report, particularly actually strikingly in terms of UK government and devolved administrations. What you might call social capital, what you might call the measures of trust do matter. So I think, again, one of the perhaps softer elements of crisis preparedness, firstly, it matters whether or not the government is trusted going into the pandemic. And secondly, has the government tested and tried the different ways of communicating with people in emergencies to see which is most effective. So that's a crucial part of it. But of course, and I think COVID brings this out, it is also the first, if you like, it is the first global emergency in the ultra-information age. And so everyone is free to put out various bits of information to which government is competing for attention as never before. And David may well have very interesting views on that, to which I would defer.
So David.
No. Yeah. Just a few points. It's a great question. And the first is we know what the principles are of good communication, and they have not changed. And honesty in communication and transparency in the evidence behind decisions that are then communicated to the public are key. And the British government had to learn as it went along. For example, making public the names of the scientists who were sitting on the main advisory committee, and then deciding that the minutes of those advisory committees should actually be made public. So those are the kinds of steps that we shouldn't have to hesitate over when the next crisis arrives. So that the third principle is, and it's hard sometimes for elected politicians, but they have to be prepared to change their minds when the evidence changes. And there's a classic case here with COVID about the size of the coronavirus particle, 5 microns, and the fact that it turned out really to be an airborne spread disease. And that meant different advice having to go to the public, with all the risk that the newspapers will turn around and point their finger at ministers and say, you've changed your mind, this is a U-turn. No, it isn't. New science has produced different precautions which need to be taken. So there are lots and lots of lessons, I think, to learn. But the other point that Ciaran has touched on, which is really important, is there's no going back. We are now in a digitized information age, and there will be social media comment, and there will be some deliberate disinformation. Some will be foreign, some will be domestic, from groups who feel passionately about things. So that information gap between what people are picking up from their day-to-day social media and what the real underlying reality is, ministers are going to have to, and public spokesmen people are going to have to tackle. I'll pass in the interests of time on the deeper question, which is when you have deliberately harmful misinformation about, for example, vaccines on the internet, what does a government do to reassure the public and tell the public that this is information that should not be recirculated? That's another issue.
Mm-hmm. And of course, throughout the pandemic, the World Health Organization, I think, did a good job in developing advice on that for governments about how to deal with the infodemic. And that goes to Cheryl Lynn's question about whether there's an international organization in the world that's responsible for answering questions from people in case of an emergency. And I think the answer to that, Cheryl, is it depends which kind of emergency. If it's civil aviation, it's one international organization. If it's a health crisis, it's the World Health Organization. But I don't know if Sir David or Ciaran had anything to add on that question.
Just very quickly, I think just looking at the question, I mean, the WHO, as you said, Nairi, did all sorts of things, many of which were beneficial. It wasn't answering questions from people all over the world because it's not designed to do that. And I think very few public authorities are. Just one thing that I learned from direct experience in cybersecurity, and this is interesting in terms of non-public health things where people will turn to the WHO. I mean, there's certainly no global body and unlikely to be one in that sort of case. But one of the things I learned was that people from all over the world look at other governments' advice. And there is something around inconsistencies and gaps between that advice, because half a century ago, if the governments of the United Kingdom and Australia, two very similar and two close allied countries, had given different advice on the same thing, no one would really have noticed. Nowadays, they'll notice instantaneously. So there is something around this in terms of not just international learnings, but international cooperation, because again, if the objective is trust, countering disinformation and so forth, people will read other governments' stuff in a way that they never did before.
Mm-hmm. The other point I'd throw in there is quite a lot of evidence on who the public does trust. And it isn't necessarily the elected politician. There's a role for the expert. And I think the British government did a very good job in bringing up to the forefront the chief medical officer and the government's chief scientist to produce, charts, graphs, statistic, rational explanation behind the measures that were being taken. I think most of the public will trust the person in the white coat rather more than they'll trust, for example, the civil servant in the suit.
So before we've got time for one last question, and then I'm going to turn to Sir David and Ciaran to invite them to tell us what we should all be looking for in a year's time to know if the government is beginning to prepare for the management of long-term crises. But I do want to pick up a question by Councillor Susan Brown, who was sitting in the Oxford City Council during COVID, and writes that her impression was that the national government's instinct to centralise was quickly challenged by the reality that it simply couldn't, that local government had a voice that it hadn't had for years, but that lessons weren't being learned. So her question is, how did that centralising instinct vary across different areas of government in different times? So it's a big question, but was there any reflection that either Ciaran or Hester had on that?
Very quickly, the centralising instinct is very strong. I think the moment where it comes out most strongly is in the then Prime Minister's statement in the 10th and 11th of May on TV and in Parliament, where routinely responsibilities of various jurisdictions are confused and it's assumed that the UK government is in charge. I think that reveals, if you like, a mindset. I think Councillor Brown's certainly right that in terms of operational realities and in terms of voices at the table, the UK government did quite well. There was an interesting sort of legacy of no-deal Brexit planning where there were groups of local leaders who'd already had a voice and established relationships. But I think there are two things. One is there's a real, in terms, go to your other point about what should be being done as a result, there is a really difficult but essential exercise about when things are better done at national level. So some things, clearly vaccine procurement and distribution, done superbly by consolidating and centralising power. Other things, much, much less so. And I think the instinct was that in all forms of procurement that should be done. And as Councillor Brown said, that didn't work. I think that to slightly modify her question, one of the lessons, certainly if you just take England, never mind the relations with the devolved administrations, I think what we need to do is get out of what's almost the worst possible place, which is a sort of doctrine and legislative framework which places huge amounts of responsibility in the local response mechanism, and a culture of centralisation when something actually happens. You kind of centralise the doctrine and the practice, or localise them both. Don't do it halfway.
Yeah. It's one of the subjects I cover in my forthcoming book, little advertisement for that. But the doctrine is very clear. In a crisis, you decentralise decisions on what should be done at the local level, because only at that level will you have the granularity of information and the timeliness to take the right decisions. What you centralise at government level is the strategic direction, and as Ciaran says, only the decisions that only government can take, releasing more resources, drafting emergency legislation and so on. Those things have to be done centrally, but it is a golden principle that you can't micromanage the totality of a large crisis. Where the real problem comes in the last few years is, of course, in the media, because there is a natural, understandable, and entirely justifiable interest in democratic politicians managing what is said to the public. And for that, of course, they demand detailed information. But the trick of really good crisis survival is having that data, having the information about what is going on in a very timely way, but not using it as the opportunity to insert a long screwdriver to start messing around with decisions which have already been taken or are being taken at a local level. When it all works well, I think in the UK we have a really good system that understands those principles, but there are tensions within it. And I say the tension of the centre wanting to know every detail because it may have to answer the question, well, will have to answer questions from the media, and being able to trust local decision makers to take the best decision for the people in that locality at that time.
Excellent. So I think it's a really powerful note to end on, that in a year's time, what the rest of us might be looking for is a much clearer delineation of not just the duties of local governments, but the resources and what's going to give them trust both to share data and take decisions. And on the central side, a sense of what roles the centre must play and what roles the centre mustn't play, and what the centre needs to do to engender the trust at local level to share the data. I think that last point about to have clear, coherent communications would require real trust between local devolved government and central government in the sharing of information and the sharing of practice, so that they can actually work together in a coherent way. On behalf of all the audience, and indeed the researchers and community of the Blavatnik School, I'd like to thank Sir David Omand for his excellent remarks this morning, and encourage you all to look for his book on crises on the 1st of June. But more than anything else, to thank Ciaran for leading a really difficult, tricky piece of research in record time, and the extraordinary contributions that Hester Khan, Max Fink, and in the editing of this report, Ruth Collier have made in drawing the whole together into a thoroughly readable report. So if I can end this morning's session by just saying, download the report, take a read. There's something for you even if you've only got 10 seconds to read the 10 recommendations or 2 minutes to read the 10-page summary. And thank you for joining us this morning. Thank you all.